Here I've got a Rodenstock Ysarex Retina Ysarex lens, 50mm f2.8. This is from a Retina Reflex S camera. I've just finished servicing the camera body and I'm about to deal with the lens now. More commonly I see these cameras with the Schneider Xenar lens, but this is the Rodenstock equivalent. I expect it's fairly similar. Can't remember when I last serviced one of these. It'll be some time ago. Using a friction tool to unscrew the black conical section in the centre there. Is that loose? Yep. The thread's a bit dry. It's hardly surprising. They don't require any lubrication. This piece should just pick out. This is the mount for the lens hood. The thread in the centre here, that would take a Kodak filter, the 29.5mm filters, the screw-in filters, which Kodak helpfully labelled 32. Put those to one side. Here we have 3 screws holding the lens barrel into the body. I'm not going to bother marking the position of anything here. This is where you would make your focus adjustment upon reassembly, and I will set all that up afterwards. Tip those screws and their washers out. Do a quick count, make sure I got them all. 3 screws, 3 washers. Lift out our lens barrel. So here's our barrel. Here's our main helical, if you like, that focuses the lens in and out. The grease in that is very dry. I'm just checking the state of the diaphragm. I'm not letting that snap back. Some of these blades don't like that. They'll shear their pins off them if you let it go with a real fast snap. I'm just checking there's no stickiness there. That all seems very good. I noticed that the front lens surface is quite dusty. Once I've got that clean later on, I'll be able to tell whether the lens needs to come apart for any further cleaning. So we're down to the lens, the outer lens component here. That focus there is very stiff. Just checking the 2 levers on the side. One of these controls the depth of field pointers. Excuse me, and that's quite stiff too. It doesn't want to return under its own steam there, so it's a bit gummed up. A bit of dust, probably a bit of grease, who would know. So 4 screws from the back, remove those, and I will carefully put them aside in order so that I know exactly where they came from. Always lay the parts out neatly so you know the order of reassembly. It doesn't hurt to take photos along the way. Alright, so remove the back, the lens mount component. One section in here, and in this case it's quite stiff. That brass ring you see there is the cam for the would suit the rangefinder on a Retina 3S rangefinder camera. The cam can be seen in the groove here. That's quite stiff. That's coupled to the focus mechanism in the lens, and that would of course been helping to make that focus mechanism stiff. So that would need to be stripped and cleaned and reassembled with probably a little smear of lubricant. take off our components here in order. This little shim was the second to last to go on. This lever here was the last, so the shim goes on before that when reassembling. Here we have a pin dropping into a cam down here, which I'll carefully separate if I can. And the spring comes round to the post here, taking note of which spring it is in case we lose them. It's the heavier of the two springs. This is a lot of dust and dirt in here, so all this will need a bit of cleaning. We can lift off this pointer for our depth of field scale. Now I can see this is all quite dirty. Quite odd. It may have been graphite grease in there that's lost all its fluid binder. There's a lot of dark powdery looking stuff, still a bit greasy, probably graphite. Take off that piece there. That serves to separate the two pointers because they counter rotate and they would have probably a bit more friction if you left that in there. Let's lift out that cam. Lift off the second pointer. That's quite sticky. Right, so we're down to the focus mount itself now pretty much. I'll just flip that spring to one side and I'm checking my focus mount and it feels quite dry and gritty. I don't like the feel of that, so it's got to come apart. This spring has got a little post on the centre of it, of that screw, so you need a special tool, a screwdriver with a slot in the middle of it to drop over that post if you're going to remove that, but I've found from experience that you can generally leave that one in place and work around it. So I'm going to lift out the other three screws holding these guides in place, and these pieces hold the two sections together, as you'll see shortly. Two of those wedges I can lift straight out now. They're covered in some very low friction material. This one here is tucked underneath that little separator bar there, so I can't lift it out at the moment. Now this piece, I should just about be able to separate these now. I can. So I can tip that last piece out. And here we have the focus scale ring, and you can see that there's quite a pronounced amount of dirt and dried grease in there, and similarly here. So all those I've got to clean off and relubricate and reassemble. All these components I will clean in much the same way. I'll be using a little bit of naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, on a cotton bud or a Q-tip to remove all traces of old grease, any dust, anything that looks like a contaminant that shouldn't be there. The front of the lens, the focus mount here, where that is grease has been driven in over the last few decades, it leaves the aluminium slightly stained, but that's all it'll be. It'll just be staining. It's not really anything serious, so don't be too surprised where those components were rubbing together. If you're left with marks that won't come away. You can go through quite a few cotton buds doing things like this. Just wipe that fine spring while I'm here. Sometimes you can get that off its post without any trouble at all. Other times it doesn't want to come. It's so easy to damage them. Sometimes it's easy to leave the spring in place and work around it. There are some tasks when you're repairing cameras that you're better to get springs off and put them safely to one side while you're working on things, because otherwise they will come off by themselves at some inopportune moment and get lost. But this isn't one of those times. Alright, I'll just use a toothpick and run the toothpick around that groove in the lens body there, and just to loosen up any embedded grease and grit. That feels a lot better. Around the centre here, that's where the rings for the depth of field pointers and things run. That should be oil free, otherwise they will not move smoothly and they'll have a high resistance. That looks good. So we've got our two major components cleaned. I'll clean these three wedges and then we can reassemble this section. This process is pretty much identical to doing the same task with a Xenar lens. Right, well, one of these wedges needs to be put in place now, loosely, because of the little brass guide rail here. I've got to drop that into place first because I can't just drop it in later. I'll take a little bit of molybdenum paste and just run it around the inside of that groove that these wedges will run into. They'll hold this piece together. I'll just run a tiny smear on that front surface there too. Assembling these two pieces together, and I don't lose that wedge, no, that's good. It needs to be hooked into the fixed wedge that we left in there, the one with the spring. And assemble it so that the focus scale is on the same side as the pointer, otherwise it will not go together. And that wedge is just twisted around just to cause me grief. That's better. So that's sitting down in place. We've got our loose wedge here that we haven't fixed down with a screw yet. And we should have two more. One over here. One over here. I'll put the screw in here first. That's opposite the post that's got the spring on it. If I can just get the screw to cooperate. He doesn't want to. that part up. Just get that started. Just checking that it's not tight, it's not binding. And I'm checking for play. I'm flexing the lens this way and that way to see if there's any play. And there doesn't appear to be any play, so I've probably got that in about the right position. So I'm just going to tighten that screw up and check again. It's smooth and I'm not getting any rattle. So that's good. That tells me that I've got that centered up quite nicely there. We get these other two into position. And these little wedges that hold the lens together, the two pairs, they're slotted so you can move them slightly, so you need to adjust them to keep the lens centered in the outer part. Otherwise it'll be stiff. It won't want to move smoothly. It'll rub. But it isn't hard to achieve. I'll just do those up very lightly. Check that it's still smooth to operate. And those two, which were these ones and these ones, I'm going to try, see if there's any clearance, see if there's too much movement there by flexing the lens slightly. There's a little bit of extra clearance there. So I'm deciding at this point whether there's a bigger gap on this side than that side, and I will move one of them in accordingly. And I think I'll move this one in just slightly. Oh, that's definitely stiffer. I'm just deciding whether it's smooth. It is very smooth, it's good. I'll check those screws, tighten the four of them up. Or the three of them, because one of them I didn't disturb. That feels good. So that's the focus side of the mount fixed up. We can clean up these components and drop them back into place. And of course it's just a case of putting them back in the opposite order we took them out. Here I'm clearing any grease and oil off these surfaces. These are very broad, flat surfaces. Any oil on those surfaces tends to stick things together. The oil doesn't want to shear. And this will drop in on the mount right there. Drops in over those two gears. And the spring should hook over the tab on that lever there. Now our spacer, this black thing here, that tends to be greasy, and that grease does not assist it at all, so that's got to be cleaned off. I may put a smear of molybdenum on those surfaces, depending on how they look to me. That certainly looks quite different already. It was very matte grey finish when we started. I'm just going to put a tiny smear of molybdenum around the outside. Now there's pretty much nothing to be seen here. I didn't gather up a great gob of it on my stick. I just took it as it came out of the container. Now this drops into place. There's a notch in that brass divider there. This is reduced in section at this point to clear for those two little gears. I'll drop this into place. This spring needs to be hooked out so that it's running around the outside surface of that ring, not trapped underneath it. What have we got now? We've got the little cam. The cam runs in a guide track here, and it changes the rate that these levers move relative to each other, I think. I'll just run a tiny smear of molybdenum down that slot. I've cleaned that component. We can drop that into place down there. The larger, it's got two pins off it and a bush in the centre. The larger of the two pins drops into that slot. The smaller of the pins is facing up, and we'll couple with this component as soon as I've cleaned it and put it back into place, which is what we're going to do right now. You can see I'm cleaning all those broad flat surfaces and the inner edge in particular. This is our second pointer. I've just got to get it over that pin. Make sure it's lined up with the gears over here and is sitting flat over the pin, that both of these pointers are in the same position relative to the end of their tracks. That one was a little bit out, should be there. So they're both as far apart as they will go. That's the start position. That looks good. Now I'm just going to pause for a second and I'll restart the recording, otherwise my camera tends to time out. Continuing where we left off, or continuing from where we'd left off, now we need this component. This lever couples to the mechanism of the camera. There's a tab that sticks out the side. Basically what it's doing is it will control those levers, the depth of field pointers, depending on the setting. Again, these are broad flat surfaces. They do not need to have great smears of oil on them like this. All it does is it makes them stick. This is quite dirty. It's not normal to find one quite as dirty as this, but it is important to get that rubbish off. These cotton buds I'm dealing with today are not very satisfactory. The ones I used to use were made by Johnson & Johnson. They had plastic stems. They were well made, the tips were nice and soft, and they stuck to the shaft. These ones are cardboard stems and the tips just come off them. You get a bit of solvent on there and then the cotton's off the end of them. They're useless. So that that little cam that we dropped in there, that couples to a pin on here, so I've got to get that pin into that hole. That's in, and get the spring swung over and back over the post. It's the same post that the other spring is on. That's it. There's just a bit of muck on that spring. I'll see if I can lift it off. Bit of dust or hair or something. That's better. Right, so those components are all together. Pop that to one side. I'll clean these two components, get them ready, and then I've got to clean and prepare the lens mount section, because we know that that's too stiff. The action of the rangefinder coupling was too stiff. Of course, we don't need a rangefinder coupling for a Retina Reflex S, but if the owner also has a Retina 3S camera, he's probably moving his lenses from one camera to the other, and so they need to be in good order to suit both cameras. That's good. So I'll pop those components to one side. They're cleaned and ready to go, and I need to clean this mount. So we have three little tabs that hold this down to the body. I'll tip that out. So we have the main section here. I'm just giving that a good clean. Mostly I'm interested in lifting out any dust and dirt. I'll run that round the track that brass cam runs on. To be honest, it doesn't look particularly dirty, but we know it wasn't running smoothly. So I'll clean the brass cam. Again, it's not bad, but it looks very dry to me, like it had never had any lubricant at all. We do want a little bit in there. If it's assembled completely dry, it typically doesn't make it stiff in its movement, but it makes it chatter. You get a chattering effect. Better to have a tiny bit of lubricant in there so it moves smoothly. Right, that should be fine. So I'll put a bit of molybdenum paste on a toothpick and I'll just run it around that inside edge and around that inside edge for good measure. And I'm not putting in much at all, and what I do put in will find its way around all the surface. I'll run some on that cam surface there too, just so that if it is on a Retina 3S rangefinder camera, that it'll move smoothly. Alright, so I'll drop that into place. Obviously the flat side is up here, the cam surface is here. Our retainers only go in one way. You can tell which way they go because one of these holes here, there's three holes that they fit to. Turn that thing over and that drops in there, and you can see here that there's a clearance hole there in that tab, so we know that that's the direction that those tabs go. So that's a very good guide. Now let's get that in place. I don't suppose you could see through my fat fingers. I tightened that one up as I went, because these are 3 independent tabs. If it was one retaining bracket with 3 screws in it, I would have used a different technique. I would have started the screws, just run them up lightly until they were all installed, and then tightened them up. But because they're independent, there's no need to do that. I can just put them straight in and tighten the screw up straight away. Get that screw started. Job done. Alright, so that that's all done. We can bring our lens back in, or our lens mount back in. Now at this point I want to find, I've got 4 screws that I used as guideposts, well 3 actually, to help me align these components when I'm assembling it, and of course I've forgotten them. I have my 3 screws. They began their life looking like normal screws, but I ground the heads off them. So I normally start here with these 2 positions where the screws are close together. Put one there, one there. I'm not running those in very deep, otherwise they'll foul something underneath one of these positions. I forget which one it is. They're just here to help me align these components as I close this up. So there they are. So our other 2 components. We had this shim, which fits on like that. This lever, notice this tab here, that runs in the slot here on that lever. It sits there like that. Then we have the lens mount section, and as I said earlier, it's got this tab on it. This couples to the mechanism at this point, so that this cam moves with the focus ring, and so it moves the rangefinder in a Retina 3S camera. So we need to align this tab to some useful point so that we can find it as we assemble the lens here. So I've just adjusted my focus until that little fork there that couples with that is in line with that screw. I can turn this round so it's in the right position. I know where I am relative to everything, and I can see that I need to have this round at that point. If I lower this over the top of there's 3 screws, we should be in business. Drop that down into position. Flip that with my finger to make sure it's loose. I'm holding this together tightly so it doesn't shift. And I'm going to move this lever, and I want to see what happens to the depth of field pointers. They should swing together in the centre and apart. They're nice and even. They're all working together correctly. So still holding this firmly together with my hand, I'll take one of the 4 screws that holds this mechanism together and get that in place. It seems to have some anti-gravity on that one. It wants to keep jumping out of the hole. Right, I'll just run that screw down. That's good. Now I can remove these 3 guide screws that I put in there to help me align the lens components. As you can see, I didn't tighten them up, they're fairly loose in the slots. And we can put these 3 remaining screws in place. On some lenses you will find that one of the 4 positions, 4 screws here, will have been painted red. Where that's the case, it's been done to provide you an extra visual cue for lining up the lens when you go to put it on the camera. And basically what it amounts to is this. You can see we've got a red dot here, that's your alignment mark. Quite commonly the screw next to that alignment mark is also painted red. And it's just an extra visual cue so that you put the lens back on in the correct position. Just checking that everything coupled correctly. It did. My cam for the rangefinder is coupled to the focus, and you may see it swinging there in that slot as I move the focus. So our focus mechanism is nice and smooth. Our depth of field pointers nice and snappy, moving correctly. The other lever on the other side controls the diaphragm on the lens capsule, and I'm just checking that that's smooth, it's not binding at all. That's good. Our focus mount here is ready to go. You can turn my attention to this lens, and the first task is to get rid of all that old sticky grease on that helical. So I'll start with the lens capsule. Again, I'm just using naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, and I'm just wanting to lift off all that old grease. What happens with grease over time is the volatile components do exactly what volatile components do and go away, and you're left with a sticky base, and that sticky base is useful for gluing things together, but it's not very good as a lubricant. That's good. And of course I need to do exactly the same thing to this component, the other half of the helical. It's particularly dirty. Right, I'll try these 2 components together. It's a multi-start thread, of course. You can start it anywhere you like. We're not trying to reposition any finely marked alignment marks or anything. We're going to set the focus afterwards. I'm just checking the run of that. It seems just very slightly rough. I'll put a drop of naphtha on that and run it backwards and forwards a couple of times. It'll probably polish off any roughness. And I'll give that a wipe out with a bit of naphtha. You can still see there's still some muck coming off those threads, this component in particular. They're quite fine threads, as threads for this purpose go. That's okay. A little touch of roughness there perhaps, but certainly nothing to cause me any grief. I want to turn my attention to that lens surface now, make sure that that's really clean. So I need to find my glass cleaner. Alright, drop of domestic glass cleaner on a cotton bud. That's come off quite dirty. Start with another one. There's a few coating marks on this lens. Look like tiny speckles. Most likely those will have been caused by spray at some stage. I mean, you always blame sea spray for things like that, but it might not have been sea spray. Might have been a splashed drink. I'll open the diaphragm on that with my finger, and I'm checking that carefully to see if I think it looks clear and clean. And it's all good bar that external surface, which is certainly not perfect. But as I said, they're coating marks. They look worse than they are. They probably have absolutely no effect at all on the lens performance. So now we have to reassemble this. Some grease would be a handy thing. Where's the grease? What I'm using here is some grease for doing helicals. It's called Helimax XP Optical and Instrument Helicoid Grease, and I found it to be quite good. I'm just about to order some more shortly by the looks of this, because my container is looking a little bit empty, but you do not need lots. Just going to apply spots to about 6 positions around the outside of that thread. The thread's very fine, so you do not need an awful lot of grease. That's that. Work that once or twice. That grease is evenly spread around that helical now. That was all there was to it. That's something that's worth doing here. This fork couples to the lever in the mount to open and close the aperture. I'm just going to rub a little bit of molybdenum in that fork, and this slot here is the fixed post to stop the inner from turning in the mount, so that it's pulled forward and backwards by the helical. And I've put a little bit of molybdenum there too, so that that's not a high friction area. Now I've got to get this together and see if I can get this done quickly. We have to align our aperture fork and our guide post fork here with the equivalent pieces in the mount. Now the aperture post, the aperture setting, we can shift that backwards and forwards. The other of course is fixed, so I've got to check that what my alignment is like. And I might take the helical off that so I can see what I'm doing. Checking where my levers are. It's not coupling to anything useful. Right, how did I do? The aperture's opening and closing smoothly. I can drop my outer helical back in place. Get that started on there so it's well on. And drop the 3 fixing screws and their washers in place. Try and carefully not to flick them out of the window in my mad haste. If you were setting up a lens like this, because we'll be adjusting the focus shortly, if we were setting it up on a rangefinder camera, you'd have to set up a ground glass at the focus, at the film stage, in order to check the focus. Because this is going on an SLR and I've already ensured that what appears in the viewfinder matches what appears at the film plane, I've only got to use the viewfinder in order to set my focus. So I'll do that right now. So this can go back on the body, cock the shutter, and I will check my focus. And I can tell from that I am focused closer. I'm focused beyond infinity rather. So I'll slacken my 3 screws up slightly. And I want to bring my lens slightly forward. So I've turned the outer helical to bring the lens slightly forward. Now it's not quite reaching infinity, so I can slacken my 3 screws, move that in, slightly that direction. I'm just doing those screws up very lightly, but they must be done up. Otherwise the lens won't be held firmly in the mount and you would get a false impression of how well adjusted it was. That's almost correct. Just move it a little bit. Again, I'll just do those screws up very lightly. I've got a very useful infinity target right outside the window beside me. And it's absolutely excellent for doing jobs like this. On the skyline opposite, there's a well, there's a group of telegraph poles. There's also a flagpole over there too, and that they serve as a very convenient high contrast target for checking focus, particularly when you are using a split image focus, as in this rangefinder. Okay, that's absolutely spot on, that's great. So that's correct. I'll nip those 3 screws up. The focus is smooth and it doesn't have that nasty gritty sort of feel to it. What have we got left? Not much. Here I'm just interested in lifting off any grease and any grit and dust too. Here's the cone section from the centre that holds it all in place. That's all good. This piece only goes on in one position. The red dot goes to the top from memory. See if I'm telling the truth. Yep, there it is. Drops in. And the reason it only goes in one position is that it has a tab on the back of it right here, which couples to a tiny slot in the mount. So the red dot's not exactly at 12 o'clock, it's more like about 2 minutes after 12. So let me get this conical section started. Yeah, I can tell that it doesn't want to. Bring that focus out, check that that is centered and it's moving, that's all good. Friction tool, just do that up, that's good. There we have it, that's a Rodenstock Retina Ysarex f2.8 50mm lens on a Kodak Retina Reflex S camera, and that's how you strip it down and clean it. And now that's working correctly. Depth of field pointers are nice and smooth, focus is nice and smooth, lens is clean. It's not perfect, but it's as good as this lens is ever going to be. Thanks for watching.